Hi, Modern World History students. We are in unit number 6, the First World War, and we're focusing on the first question of that unit, which is, why do we fight? So the first couple of lessons of this unit have focused on the causes of World War I, why war broke out in 1914, at a time when really most of the countries involved really did not want a war. We might say that Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a war because they wanted to show that Germany had sort of come on the scene and was a powerful nation that deserved and demanded to be respected. That might be part of what's going on there. But really, most of the other countries, although they believed the war was inevitable, did not want it, and yet it came anyway. So, this um, particular Edpuzzle lesson is meant to kind of bridge the gap between our discussion of why the war happened and our discussion of how the war was conducted. And it's meant to be a kind of a game reset, an opportunity to remind ourselves who is on what team and sort of where the fighting is going to take place. So, this is kind of a very basic lesson, but it's one we have to kind of crank out before we get into talking about the fighting of the war. It'll help that story make a lot more sense. So we're on page number 8 of the unit packet, and you can see that the first two sections of the page, called Allied Powers and Central Powers, are focused on talking about who was on what team. And then the next four sections, Eastern Front, Western Front, Southern Front, Middle Eastern Front, those focus much more on where the fighting was taking place. So let's start with the Allied powers. So the Allied powers start with the countries that were committed to the war from the very beginning. So Serbia, for example, was a member of the Allied powers. And of course, they were the ones who were involved with the outbreak of the war in the first place. They were the ones who were accused by Franz Josef, the Emperor of Austria, of having been, at least indirectly, behind the assassination of his nephew and successor, Franz Ferdinand Habsburg, in Sarajevo. So Serbia will become part of the Allied powers. And remember that Russia, which was a Slavic nation, just like the Serbs were a Slavic nation, they had pledged to support Serbia and protect and defend Serbia on the basis of their Slavic brotherhood. And so Serbia will be a member of the Allied powers, and their ally, Russia, aligned with them because of their common sort of Slavic ancestry, their common Slavic culture. Um, they will both be part of the Allied powers. Now, those at the beginning of the war, that was kind of all the war needed to be. It was Austria Hungary versus Serbia and Russia. However, Germany, an ally of Austria Hungary, also joined the war on their side. And they're going to be the ones who will sort of expand the war into Western Europe. German actions will result in 3 additional countries joining the war on the side of the Allied powers. One of those was Little Belgium. And Belgium was a neutral country. Belgium was a country that sort of wasn't looking to harm anybody or get involved in any wars, but they stood in the way of a German invasion of France. And Germany intended to invade France and defeat France and knock France out of the war quickly because they saw France as a more dangerous enemy than Russia. They saw France as at least being more immediately dangerous than Russia. And in order to knock France quickly out of the war, the Germans intended to move troops through Belgium, as opposed to moving troops across their border with France, which was a very mountainous area. The Germans intended to move troops through Belgium, which was nice and flat and very easy terrain. And so poor Belgium, they get stuck in the middle of this, and Germany invades Belgium to get at France. And so Belgium ends up on the war on the side of the Allied powers as well. France, which was sort of an intractable enemy of Germany ever since Germany took Alsace-Lorraine, from them in 1870-71 during what was called the Franco-Prussian War. They will be on the side of the Allied powers. Their goal is to regain those territories. So they will also be members of the Allied powers. And then finally, the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom was certainly the least likely of all of these countries to join the war because the United Kingdom was located on an island, which allowed them to sort of pick and choose when they got involved in things going on the continent of Europe and when they didn't. It is true that they had a sort of informal alliance between themselves and France and Russia, which was called the Triple Entente. And it is true that the Triple Entente sort of formed in response to concerns about the growing aggressiveness of Germany under its leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. But the alliance between the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, the Triple Entente, was an informal one. It didn't really bind these three countries into anything. Um, and so it was doubtful, sort of right up to the last minute, whether the United Kingdom would end up joining this war. However, Germany's invasion of Belgium was really what prompted them to do so. The United Kingdom had had an alliance with Belgium as well, going all the way back to 1839. The United Kingdom had entered into that alliance out of strategic interests. They did not want a country that was hostile to Britain, to the United Kingdom, taking over Belgium, because it would be a excellent launching off point for an invasion of Britain, an invasion of the United Kingdom. And so, out of that consideration, the United Kingdom did, in fact, join the war in August of 1914 as well. So, at the beginning of the war, the Allied powers included the original three members of the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And it also included Belgium and Serbia. So, at the very beginning of the war, those five countries were known as the Allied powers. And as the war progresses, they will add additional members. So, for example, in the spring of 1915, they will actually add Italy. And you say, well, wait a minute. Italy was a member of the other alliance. Italy was a member of the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Well, that's true. Italy did have an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, an alliance dating back into the 19th century, an alliance that was established by Otto von Bismarck when he was still the Chancellor of Germany, before he was dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. It is true that Italy was a member of that alliance. However, as the Italians understood it, and as it was written, the Triple Alliance was a defensive alliance, meaning that the countries that were members of that alliance were only obligated to protect each other and support each other if one of them was attacked. And from the Italian perspective, that's not what had happened here. From the Italian perspective, it was Austria-Hungary that had made the decision to attack Serbia. And the fact that Russia had then declared war on Austria-Hungary was a consequence of Austria-Hungary's decision to attack Serbia. So, from Italy's perspective, this was not a war that began because one of her allies, Germany or Austria-Hungary, was attacked. This was a war that began because one of her allies, Austria-Hungary, had attacked someone else. So the Italians did not believe that this was their war to fight. In their view of it, they had no obligation to help Germany and Austria-Hungary fight this war because Austria-Hungary had started this war. So the Italians declared themselves neutral. The Italians stated that they were not going to be in this war on either side. So when the war broke out, Italy declared themselves neutral. However, the other Allied powers, Britain, France, they saw this as an opportunity to perhaps get Italy to join their side. And they knew that the Italians had their eyes on certain territories that were part of Austria-Hungary, here along the coast. You see, here's Italy. This is called the Adriatic Sea here. And here along the Adriatic coast were some territories that Italy had their eye on, because these were territories where Italians lived. They were not in the majority, but nevertheless, many Italians lived in those territories. These were called the irredenta, unredeemed lands by the Italians, and they wanted these territories. So the British and French said to the Italians, hey, we see that you have refused to participate in the war. You've declared yourselves neutral, but here's what we say to you. If you switch sides, if you join over and you come over to our side and you join the Allied powers, then we will see to it, after the war is over, after Germany and Austria-Hungary are defeated, we will see to it that you get these territories that you're interested in. We'll see to it that those territories are awarded to Italy as an award, for helping us beat Austria-Hungary and Germany. So, in the spring of 1915, although they had initially declared themselves neutral when the war broke out, Italy actually abandoned their former allies, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they came over and they joined the side of the Allied powers. And Italy fought the war on the side of the Allies. Another surprising country that joined the Allies, who were not a European country or not on this map, were the Japanese. You know that Japan had been growing in power ever since the Meiji Restoration of 1867-68. The Emperor Meiji had modernized Japan, had modernized Japan's army and navy, and had modernized its government and its economy. And as a matter of fact, having become a modernized country, an industrialized country, Japan then began building an empire, like all the other modernized countries were doing. Britain was building an empire, France was building an empire, Italy was building an empire, Germany was building an empire, even the United States to some extent. And so Japan began to do the same. Remember that in 1910, Japan had formally taken over Korea and added it to its empire. Now the Japanese saw an opportunity to build their empire even more. And the reason why they saw this opportunity was that Germany actually had a small number of possessions out in the Pacific Ocean. Germany owned some islands in the Pacific, and the Japanese realized that during this war, Germany was going to be very preoccupied, sort of fighting for their lives against Britain and France and Russia. And the Japanese correctly perceived that Germany's navy would be busy in Europe fighting the British Navy, and that this would open up an opportunity for Japan to strip some of those island possessions from Germany and take those over and add them to their empire instead. So when World War I broke out, the Japanese saw an opportunity to grow this new empire that they were building by taking advantage of Germany's preoccupation fighting the British and others. So Japan also declared war on Germany in 1914, and they became a member of the Allied powers. So Italy was a surprise member of the Allied powers, and Japan was a surprise member of the Allied powers. And then finally, in April of 1917, well into the war, 3 years into the war almost, the United States joined the war on the side of the Allied powers as well. The United States, when the war broke out, had initially declared itself neutral. We did not want to be in this war, and it was easy for the United States to be a neutral country. It was easy for us to avoid the war because we had an ocean separating us from Europe, where the war was going on. And so President Woodrow Wilson of the United States declared us to be a neutral country. We're not on either side during the war. However, over the course of the war, Germany was going to take some actions that would lead to the United States ultimately declaring war on Germany in April of 1917. And what those actions are, we'll get into. It had a lot to do with German submarines, the sinking cargo ships out on the Atlantic Ocean. And we'll get into the reasons why the United States declared war on Germany in more detail later in the unit. But for now, just know that ultimately the United States did join the Allied powers, and U.S. troops were fighting in World War I for roughly the last 6 months of the war. So, as far as the map is concerned, make sure that you have located and labeled Serbia, Russia, Italy, Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom. All right, so before you move on, maybe pause the Ed puzzle here and make sure that you've not only taken your notes on who the Allied powers were, but that you have located them and labeled them on the map. And I would encourage you to do this in some sort of color coding, maybe. You'll notice that I have the Allied powers labeled in blue. Maybe pick a particular color to label them on your map. So take a second, pause the video, and complete your map. All right, now let's move on to the other side of the war, the Central Powers. Okay, the Central Powers. So the Central Powers were the two remaining members of the Triple Alliance, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Um, they had been allies going back into the 19th century. It was Otto von Bismarck who had established the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. As I mentioned before, Italy had dropped out and had declared themselves neutral at the beginning of the war, later on, actually to join the Allied powers, switching sides. So that left only Germany and Austria Hungary as members of the so called Central Powers. They're known as the Central Powers because, as you can see, they're located at the center of the map. It's bad news for them because that means they'll be fighting a two front war or worse throughout this entire thing. Austria Hungary really effectively started the war um, by declaring war on Serbia. It was their Archduke, their future Emperor, Franz Ferdinand Habsburg, who was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. They blamed the government of Serbia and so declared war on Serbia. But before doing so, they made sure that Germany would support them in the war, that Germany would honor their alliance, the Triple Alliance, and support them in the event that they ended up at war with Serbia and Russia, which of course they did. So Germany and Austria-Hungary were members of the Central Powers from the very beginning of the war. But very early in the war, they added a third member, which was the Ottoman Empire. So remember, the Ottoman Empire was the empire of the Turks, right? The empire ruled by a nation of people called the Turks. And the Ottoman Empire had at times been a very large and powerful empire. The Ottoman Empire, possessed big sections of southeastern Europe. They possessed really all of what we today call the Middle East and parts of North Africa, including Egypt. They were a large empire, but they were an empire that was in decline. They were an empire that had not modernized, and as a result of not modernizing, they had failed to stop some of the different nations that they had conquered in the past from splitting off and forming their own countries. So, for example, we learned about how the Greeks declared independence. They successfully revolted against the Ottoman Empire and became independent back in 1829. Serbia was another nation of people who had once been part of the Ottoman Empire, but who had succeeded in breaking away from it and forming their own state. So the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was large and had at one time been very powerful, but was now in decline. They had been enemies of Russia for some time. And so when Austria-Hungary and Germany declared war on Serbia and Russia, it was sort of natural for the Ottoman Empire to join the war with them against the Russians. So the Ottoman Empire became the third member of the Central Powers. And there are other members who will eventually join the Central Powers during the war. But for our purposes, the purposes of a ninth grade world history class, it'll be sufficient for you to remember that the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So as you did before, take a moment, pause the video. Whatever notes you've taken about these three members of the Central Powers, that's good. But now pause the video and add them to the map. Locate and label them on the map. Pick a different color. I've got them in red. So pick a different color that will help you to distinguish between the members of the Allied powers and the members of the Central Powers. So I'll pause for a second and let you do that. Okay, so that covers the participants of World War I pretty well, the Allied powers and the Central Powers. Now we're going to talk about the fronts, and we'll add those to the map also. So a front is a location where fighting is happening, right? When a war is going on, a front is one of the locations where the actual fighting, the actual hostility is taking place between the two sides. And you can locate a front on a map, and usually a front extends along the borders of two countries. So on one side of the front, one country is fighting. On the other side of the front, the other country is fighting. They're fighting each other over the border. So that's why fronts usually extend along the borders of countries. So in this war, World War I, because so many different European countries were involved, it's a war that's being fought on four separate fronts. So there's fighting going on in 4 different locations. So we're going to start with what's called the Eastern Front. So not surprisingly, the Eastern Front is located in Eastern Europe. So this is the Eastern Front, and I would encourage you to take a moment and mark its location on your map. So have you pause for a second and mark the location of the Eastern Front on your map. So the Eastern Front, fighting erupts on the Eastern Front because of Austria-Hungary and Germany declaring war against Russia, right? And so that's why there was fighting in that part of Europe. So now take a second and see if you can identify who's going to be doing the fighting. On the side of the Allied powers, who's going to be fighting on the Eastern Front? It's going to be Russia, right? So for the side of the Allied powers, Russia will be fighting on the Eastern Front. And then for the Central powers, who's going to be doing the fighting on the Eastern Front? Okay, that'll be Germany and Austria-Hungary. As a matter of fact, during World War I, both Germany and Austria-Hungary invaded Russia, and they penetrated into Russian territory, causing all kinds of problems for Russia and ultimately leading to what is called the Russian Revolution in the spring of 1917. So that's the fighting on the Eastern Front. It's Germany and Austria-Hungary for the Central Powers invading Russia, who's the only person fighting on the Eastern Front for the Allied powers. All right, so now let's move to the Western Front. And again, you can see where the Western Front is located here, along the borders between Germany, Belgium, and France. And again, why don't you pause for a second and add the Western Front to your map. Okay, so fighting erupted on the Western Front because Germany was determined to invade France. Germany regarded France as a more immediately dangerous enemy than Russia, and so Germany wanted to knock France out of the war early on and then fight the Russians. In order to do that, the Germans invaded France by way of Belgium, bringing Belgium and the United Kingdom into the war. And so that's why fighting takes place here along what's called the Western Front. So on the Western Front, who was doing the fighting for the Central Powers? Just Germany, right? Germany's doing this one on their own. You notice that Germany is fighting a two-front war. They're fighting Russia here on the Eastern Front. Who will Germany be fighting on the Western Front? Who's doing the fighting for the Allied powers on the Western Front? Well, it's going to be Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom, the British, right? And eventually, this is where American troops will also be fighting the Germans. When the United States joined the war, they joined the fighting on the Western Front, and our troops were fighting the Germans here. So that's the Western Front. It's Germany for the Central Powers versus Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom, and eventually the United States for the Allied powers. All right, so now we'll move to the Southern Front. So again, why don't you take a moment and pause the video and mark on your map the location of the Southern Front. It stretches along Austria-Hungary's border with Serbia and Italy. So this is actually where the original war should have been fought, because after all, the war erupted because of a dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Now, eventually, Italy joined, right? They abandoned their Triple Alliance allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary and joined the side of the Allied powers. So they will be fighting Austria-Hungary as well. They're trying to establish their claims on these lands they have their eyes on. So on the Southern Front, who is fighting on the side of the Central Powers? Okay, that's Austria-Hungary, right? So Austria-Hungary is also fighting a two-front war. They are invading Russia here on the Eastern Front, but they're also fighting here on the Southern Front. Who are they fighting against? Which of the Allied powers are they fighting against? Well, it'll be Serbia and Italy. Now, one thing I need to let you know is that eventually Austria-Hungary is going to find that they are not capable of fighting this war. They've bitten off way more than they can chew. fighting a war against Russia in the east and Serbia and Italy in the south. And they eventually have to beg for help from their big brothers, the Germans. So ultimately, Germany will also join the war on the Southern Front. Germany will basically take over Austria Hungary's failing war effort on the Southern Front. And once they do, things turn around and the Austrians do much better once they have German support. But what that meant for Germany was look, they're now fighting on three fronts. They're fighting on the Eastern Front against Russia. They're fighting on the Western Front against Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and eventually the United States. And they're fighting on the Southern Front against Serbia and Italy as well. So Germany really took on this sort of gargantuan, Herculean task during World War I. And the fact that they came so close to winning the war is really a testament to how powerful and how strong Germany's military was during World War I. Now we'll move on to the last of the fronts, which is called the Middle Eastern Front. And the Middle Eastern Front runs right off the map. This is a map which focuses on Europe, but this was technically a world war. And so there was fighting going on in Asia as well. And of course, you already know in the Pacific, where the Japanese were kicking the Germans out of their little island possessions. And of course, North America will eventually become involved in the war with the entry of the United States, fighting on the Atlantic Ocean. So it truly was a world war, although it's most of the fighting is focused in Europe. But the Middle Eastern Front stretches from Europe across to Asia. And this involves fighting by the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is located here, but the Ottoman Empire stretches all the way around off the map into what we today call the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, and then down here across to Egypt. So the Ottoman Empire is very large, and it was attacked in multiple locations. Now, it's obvious that the Ottoman Empire is fighting for the Central Powers on the Middle Eastern Front. Who was fighting for the Allied powers on the Middle Eastern Front? That's a tough one. Can you figure it out? Who would have the kind of naval capacity to fight a war several hundred miles away from their home? Now, that would be the British, right? So in the Middle Eastern Front, it's mostly the Ottoman Empire versus the United Kingdom because they have the naval capacity to fight a war all the way over here. I will let you know that a lot of the fighting is done by soldiers from the British Empire or from former British Empire colonies that are now known as the Commonwealth. So after the British Empire began to break apart and certain countries of the British Empire gained their independence, they remained aligned with Britain in a sort of an alliance called the British Commonwealth. And so here on the Middle Eastern Front, you have soldiers from Australia, soldiers from New Zealand doing a lot of the fighting against the Ottoman Empire. But that's something that's more enrichment credit type stuff. We'll come back to that later. So on the Middle Eastern Front, it's the Ottoman Empire fighting for the Central Powers versus mostly the British, the United Kingdom for the Allied powers. So now you've got a pretty sufficient sense of who was fighting the war, who was on whose team, where the fighting was happening, and which countries were doing the fighting. And that's really, really important for you to understand the story of the war. And that's as far as I need to go today in this particular ed puzzle, was simply to give you a sense of who's on whose team and where the fighting's going to happen. And so when we come back and we start telling the story of the fighting of the war, hopefully it'll make a lot more sense to you. And I'll look forward to teaching you that lesson. But until then, take good care of yourselves. I hope you're staying healthy and staying safe. I'll talk to you soon. So long, Modern World History students.